Okay, so ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Art Club. Welcome to the more formal part of our ceremony today to honor James Rives Childs. My name is Ted Delaney. I'm the director of the Lynchburg Museum System and the Chief Public History Officer for the City of Lynchburg. And I'm so glad that you all are here today. Just so you all know, this is the 56th historic marker that has been installed and dedicated within the city limits, out of about 2,500 now in the state of Virginia. And my predecessor, Doug Harvey at the Museum System, coined the expression that Jane White is Lynchburg's Johnny Appleseed of historic markers. And here we are today celebrating one more of Jane's great projects. So we're going to go by our program here that's printed and that I hope everybody has a copy of right here. We won't do separate introductions for everybody, but I just wanted to welcome you all and then turn things over to Bo Wright, our councilman-elect, who will say a few words. Bo?
Thanks very much, Ted. And I'll try to be brief, which is not the want of anybody in politics, but I'll do my best. So, good afternoon, and I'm really excited to be here. But first, I think we ought to give a big round of applause to Jane White. Not just for inviting me to participate in this ceremony, but for her long-standing and incredibly hard work on behalf of our community and her overwhelming dedication to our city's history. Tens of thousands of people each year enjoy treasures all around Lynchburg, the Old City Cemetery, the Ann Spencer Garden, Tinbridge Hill, to name a few, because of Jane. So thank you very much. And thanks also to the sponsors and the many supporters of this important historical marker. And of course, thanks to you all for being here and for starting this whole process to begin with.
Thank you.
So I'm thrilled to be here for a couple reasons. The first is that as a Lynchburg native and lover of local history, I think probably like many of you, I covet my copy of Lynch's Ferry when it arrives, you know, and read it cover to cover. I think it's important that we both remember and take pride in those individuals in our community who make a positive difference in our world, whether locally or at the national or international level. And there is a lot about James Rives Childs to take pride in. He was a Renaissance man. He served our country loyally for decades, and in the process had a hand in saving over 1,000 lives during World War II. Which brings me to the second reason that I'm pleased to be here, because I don't believe that Rives Childs was an anomaly. I think, in fact, he's representative of who we are here in Lynchburg and what we're about. He valued education. He got a master's degree from Harvard. He was intensely curious about the world, becoming an authority on Casanova, which is one of the strangest pieces of information I learned. Yeah, it's weird, but awesome. He valued country over partisanship, serving as a career diplomat. And when it mattered most, he valued humanity over protocol, saving thousands of lives and saving people from certain death. So these are the kind of folks that we put out in the world here in Lynchburg. Smart, thoughtful, compassionate human beings. Rives Childs just happens to be one of the more prominent. So I could go on and on about Lynchburg and our people, but Jane said I had 3 minutes, no more, no less, to talk. But I'm pretty sure I'm a little bit ahead, so I'm going to cede my valuable time to more worthy speakers. But before I do, to each of you, thank you for being here. Thanks for supporting this effort to preserve and celebrate Lynchburg history and the memory of Rives Childs. We're really grateful to you. So thank you very much.
Thank you. I'm Al Chambers, and I'm going to talk a little bit about what Flo Trawick just did. To give you a brief overview on Virginia's historical highway marker program. As with so many other distinctions, Virginia was the very first state in the Union to inaugurate a program of historical highway markers. The idea behind them was the brainchild of somebody named Richard Wright, maybe a kinsman, who in 1926 persuaded Virginia's governor that he had a good idea. Well, Virginia's governor at that time was Harry F. Byrd Sr., and as you know, most of what Governor Byrd wanted to get done got done. The Virginia General Assembly, under Byrd's direction, created something called the Conservation and Economic Development Commission to advertise the state's historic resources to a growing traveling public. Part of that advertising campaign was the Markers program. It started fairly modestly in 1927, 91 years ago, when a handful of markers were erected alongside U.S. Route 1, then the state's major north-south highway between Washington and Richmond and Point South. At the time, also, and this is important, Route 1 was one of the few paved roads in the state of Virginia. Well, most of those markers still exist, and you'd easily recognize them with their distinctive shape, their dark lettering on a silver background, and at the top, a small silhouette of the Virginia state seal. In fact, in outline, they're identical to the marker that Flo just dedicated. The initial design was so good and so recognizable that it hasn't changed at all in almost a century. Well, to assist the Conservation Commission in selecting which historic sites or properties should be commemorated by these markers, a committee of prominent Virginians, historians, including Lynchburg's own Douglas Southall Freeman, was appointed. Notice that I mentioned that historic sites or properties were to be the focus. At that time, at the beginning, individuals were not considered as major subjects to be recognized and honored. It really was a tourism program to identify and promote places that could be seen and hopefully visited. Individuals such as Rives Childs, no matter how prominent, weren't considered appropriate subjects at that time. Well, at the outset, most of the markers commemorated sites and places associated with two major wars, both fought in great part on Virginia's soil, the American Revolution and the Civil War. As I think Ted said, or maybe Bo, there are now over 2,500 historical markers in the Commonwealth. Over 400 of those do relate to Civil War sites, and a dozen of those are in Lynchburg. In fact, one of them is just up Vermont Avenue in the 1100 block, a stone's throw away. It was put up in 1941, and it marks the line of Lynchburg's inner defenses of 1864, when shallow entrenchments were hastily constructed and manned by cadets from the Virginia Military Institute to help defend the city from Union General David Hunter's raid. I know that because yesterday I stopped and took a look and read it. And I just wonder if any of you have ever done the same. Shame on you, but that's par for the course. Well, I admit it's not easy to stop your car on busy Vermont Avenue to read a historical marker. And when it was possible in the early days of the program, small paved areas called waysides were provided so that the traveling public could stop and read the text without causing a traffic jam or, worse yet, an automobile wreck. To help keep that from happening, and also to help promote the program, the Commonwealth has published printed guidebooks, one in 1930, then 1973, and then 1990. Now, of course, the easiest and most up-to-date way to read these markers is to just simply go online. Well, the marker program was suspended during World War II, and when it resumed in 1946, the responsibility for erecting and maintaining the markers was transferred to the Virginia Department of Highways, while the responsibility for researching and approving new markers was assigned to the Virginia State Library. The State Library continued to have jurisdiction over the marker program until 1966, when the General Assembly transferred the program to the newly created Virginia Historic Landmarks Commission. That commission, in turn, was the predecessor agency, or parent, for want of a better word, to the Virginia Department of Historic Resources, which now administers the program. Over the years, individuals did become the subjects of these markers, as the program began to seek not only to identify places that were historically significant, but to identify the people who made that history happen. Lynchburg's first historical marker, commemorating an individual, was erected in 1951 to honor Carter Glass. It's on Church Street between 8th and 9th Streets, at the site of his now demolished birthplace. And I mentioned earlier that the distinguished Virginia historian Douglas Southall Freeman helped identify appropriate places to be honored with these markers, and he too is now so honored. Side-by-side markers on Main Street near 5th mark the birthplace of the two Freeman brothers, Douglas and Allen, the latter a prominent physician. Side-by-side markers on Memorial Avenue honor Dr. Robert Withers Morgan, a distinguished doctor, and his daughter, the artist Georgia Weston Morgan. Downtown, in front of the Craddock Terry Hotel, a marker dedicated in September 2016 honors folk singer Seal Turner, and I know a lot of you all were there for that dedication. And last year, a marker on Ford Avenue was dedicated to honor the musician Helen Pesci Wood. So I think you'll have to agree that Rives Childs is going to find himself in very honorable company. Well, one of the most unusual of the 2,500 Virginia highway markers doesn't commemorate a person or a place. It commemorates an event, a catastrophe, actually, and I'm sure every one of you has seen that, even though you haven't read this one up the street. It's on the Nelson County wayside, so it's easily seen. It's north of Livingston, and it commemorates Hurricane Camille. It states that on August 20, 1969, torrential rains in excess of 25 inches within a 5-hour period swept away 100 bridges, burying 900 buildings, and killed over 100 people in the county. Well, that natural disaster was followed several years later by a man-made disaster. In 1976, the year of our nation's bicentennial, Virginia's General Assembly did something very perverse, if not completely unpatriotic. They passed a bill to curtail state funding for new or replacement historical markers. But that dishonorable discharge didn't stop the program, it just changed it. Today, all funds for new markers come from private sources, as Jane said down at the dedication, or local governments. Markers may be sponsored by anyone, and the responsibility of preparing the text of a marker is also the responsibility of individuals or groups. And I'll mention in a second how fortunate Lynchburg is in this regard. But it's still the responsibility of the Department of Historic Resources to review and approve the application for the markers and to arrange for their fabrication, while the Virginia Department of Transportation retains responsibility for the erection of new markers and the maintenance of existing ones. Well, no overview of Virginia's historical highway markers program in Lynchburg could be given without mentioning our own indomitable historian, Janie Appleseed White. She's the reason I said Lynchburg is so fortunate regarding this program. According to an article in the Lynchburg News, James has successfully applied for and sponsored 15 markers in and around the city, and some of those are to the people I've just listed. What the newspaper didn't say is that, thanks to Jane, Lynchburg's Pierce Street between 12th and 14th Streets now has more historic markers per square inch than any comparable two-block stretch in the entire state. Pierce Street, of course, is where many of Lynchburg's leading African-American citizens lived, and there are now markers there identifying so many of them. Ann Spencer, Chauncey Spencer, Dr. Robert Walter Johnson and his tennis court, and Amelia Perry Pry. And a block away on Buchanan Street, another marker commemorates Pauline Maloney, one of Lynchburg's most prominent educators. Jane, of course, is with us today, and I'm sorry to say that she has a sore throat. So I'm now going to turn the program over to Ted, who's going to tell us just exactly what Rives Childs is all about. Thank you.
Okay, so to help save Jane's voice, she asked me to read her brief remarks about James Rives Childs, answering the question, who was Rives Childs? A piece written for the American Foreign Service Association begins, Childs had led many lives. He was a volunteer ambulance driver, a U.S. Army cryptographer in France during World War I, post-war White House correspondent, American Relief Administration official in the famine-stricken Soviet republics in the 1920s, and a Foreign Service officer whose 30-year career culminated with ambassadorships in both Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia after World War II. He also wrote 15 books, ranging from definitive studies of Casanova and French writers of the 18th century to several works touching on his Foreign Service career, including his final memoir, Let the Credit Go, published in 1983. Born in Lynchburg in the 1890s, his father was active in tobacco trade, then in insurance, until a stroke left him disabled for many lingering years. His mother was a teacher in the Lynchburg public school system early in her life, and then paused for marriage and to raise a family. She then resumed her career as a principal and educator for a total of 44 years here in Lynchburg. After her husband's death, she remained at the family home where we just left, 911 Rivermont Avenue, until the 1940s, when she was often seen in her garden, always wearing mourning black. In Rives Childs' first book, this huge book right here, called Relics of the Rives, a gigantic genealogical reference book, he wrote of his mother's community service and ancestral lineage, and that she was invited into membership in the Colonial Dames of Virginia by virtue of her descent from 14 members of the House of Burgesses. This was a first indication that this type of thing was very important to Childs. He was educated in Lynchburg public schools, and in 1909 he entered VMI, where he studied for 2 years. Then he transferred to Randolph-Macon College in Ashland, Virginia, where he graduated in 1912. His great-grandfather, Bishop John Early, another Lynchburger, on his mother's side, was one of 3 founders of Randolph-Macon College, and Childs maintained a close relationship with that college for years. He then received a master's degree from Harvard University in 1915. One of the things that Jane found most fascinating about Childs was his life in Russia after World War I, his service of feeding 3 million Russians through his work as a director with the American Relief Association, and meeting his wife Georgina there. She was the daughter of Russian nobility, and her family lineage papers had been destroyed by the Bolsheviks during the Revolution. Jane understood that she was fluent in a number of languages and a warm, friendly, and gracious individual. In contrast, Rives Childs had sometimes been described as a bit stiff. Good manners were extremely important to him, and as you can imagine, that makes a lot of sense for someone who's an ambassador representing our country abroad. His Foreign Service career began in 1923 and evolved from place to place in the Middle East over a 30-year period, sometimes as consul or chargé d'affaires. He served in Bucharest, Jerusalem, Palestine, Cairo, Tangiers in Morocco, Jeddah in Saudi Arabia, and Yemen, and was later ambassador to both Saudi Arabia and Ethiopia. News reports of the time say he was instrumental in negotiating the Persian Gulf Dhahran Air Base Treaty in 1946, which at that time was the most important base in the Middle East. So what of his connections to Virginia? Yes, Childs did return to Lynchburg fairly often after his retirement from the Foreign Service in the 1950s. There were news stories about his visits to Lynchburg in social columns, as well as an extensive write-up by Lib Wiley on a visit he made with his wife to Lynchburg in 1962. In this particular article, Childs was quoted as saying, quote, "There is really no place like the Old Dominion. Virginia is one of the few places in the world where good manners are preserved. It is a delight." We also know that he visited Ashland, Virginia, home of Randolph-Macon College, where he received an honorary doctorate degree and was a visiting lecturer. He also gave his collection of everything related to Casanova to Randolph-Macon College. Evidently, he gave much more of his writings, but they were not able to house them all, so they are split up in several locations, some of it now at the University of Virginia in the Special Collections Library there, where there are now 55 boxes, including 19,000 items of his research being preserved. And there are also some of his papers at the Library of Stanford University in California. Earlier I mentioned a book, his autobiography, entitled Let the Credit Go. This actually relates to the work that he did as the chargé d'affaires in Tangiers, Morocco, directly across the Mediterranean from Gibraltar, in assisting the 1,200 Hungarian Jews who obtained the visas and were able to escape the Holocaust in Europe. Rene Reichman of the American Jewish Joint Distribution Committee was heavily involved in this process and enlisted his help. Both of them, as well as the Spanish High Commissioner at the time, were important in this effort to save these people from certain death. He decided the important thing was that it be done, and that all the lives of those were saved, not who got the credit. He evidently treasured his letter of commendation that he received for this work and kept it with him on his person for many years, but decided, as the title said, to let the credit go to others. He was quoted as writing, quote, "I do not know of any work which I have done in my whole career which has given me greater personal satisfaction than the efforts made on behalf of those friendless persons." No question Rives Childs was considered Lynchburg his home, as worldly as he was. After his wife of 42 years died suddenly in Nice, France, where they resided after his retirement from the Foreign Service, he had her remains, as well as those of his mother-in-law, brought to Lynchburg and buried here at Spring Hill Cemetery, where he himself was also later buried. His parents and older brother are buried there beside him as well. All of them are within a few feet of the obelisk on the mound of his great-grandfather, Bishop John Early, the Methodist minister from Lynchburg. Clearly, family and Lynchburg were important to him. Since discovering Rives Childs, Jane found that there are indeed a number of others that did know him in some way, and so we are now going to move to the section of our program for personal reminiscences of Childs. They will explain their various reminiscences or remembrances and connections to him, that add important aspects to his personality and career. I want to make one amendment to the program. We have City Councilman Randy Nelson with us. We will add him to the list. And unfortunately, Dr. Meadows could not be here with us today. He had to be out of town unexpectedly. But I'll just pass on that he is grateful for the attention that the property is getting. And he wanted all of us to know that he is in the process of restoring the house at 911 Rivermont. He says that the interior is being gutted as we speak. He's working to make it very historically accurate in the restoration, and that he plans to have it officially finished in May of 2020. So that's coming. All right, so we will start with Ani Bennett. There she is. Come on up, Ani.
I will call this, I wrote a little note, a brief encounter. I was born on the Atlantic coast of France, but I was raised in the French Riviera in Nice in the post-war era in the early 1950s. At the age of 18, I decided to go to England to study English literature and learn the language. I had accepted an au pair position with a host family in Liverpool. I had never flown, and I was a little uneasy traveling alone. And the British Airways plane was almost empty. However, I noticed an elegant elderly couple 3 rows ahead of me, and I was conscious that the air hostess stopped regularly to offer the couple tea, any kind of beverage, maybe champagne, I don't know. But the gentleman who was seated near the aisle, 3 rows in front of me, during the flight kept turning and looking at me. I was sitting all alone in that big plane, and I thought, well, maybe I remind him of a family member or a friend. I didn't know why he was looking at me. And in London, I knew that I would have to go through the customs. And the custom officer was rather short with me. And he asked, "Do you have anything to declare?" No, I don't have, and I probably did this, no. And all of a sudden, the distinguished gentleman in the elegant attire appears on my left, and in a gentle and very poised manner, he asked the custom officer, "What seems to be the trouble?" He turned to me and in French asked me if I had anything to declare. And I said yes. 2 dolls for the young girls in my hosting family. And he softly translated and promptly left me. I didn't have time to say anything. I was delayed with my suitcase after the custom officer spent a lot of time trying to find anything. And I was looking for exit number 2, where I knew I was supposed to meet the lady who was to take me to the train to go to Liverpool. As I was looking for the exit, I realized that the couple was standing just behind me. They should have been gone by then, but there they were. And I realized that the couple was obviously making sure that I was met and not left alone. In Liverpool, I mentioned the story to my English family, thinking I had been helped by a noble gentleman. Frankly, I thought he was from the royal family. So I was all excited. I admired his presence and I loved his hat. I imagine my surprise 66 years later when I saw his picture in the newspaper in Lynchburg. I looked and I recognized him right away. I said, "This is the man who helped me going through the customs." I was really, it took me a minute to make sure it was the right person. And when I saw that they were from Nice, I said, "Oh yes, there he is." And in retrospect, I understand now that the ambassador was very aware that I was traveling alone and was ready to help, as he had done it many times in other countries under different circumstances, but he did it for so many other people. Today, I'm delighted to be part of the celebration to honor this most kind and distinguished Virginian gentleman. And I never had time to say goodbye and thank you. He just left. So what are the odds, 66 years later, to see something like this in the newspaper? Thank you, I enjoyed it very much.
Christopher DeMarco here? Yes. Okay, come on up, please.
Good afternoon, and please forgive my disheveled and somewhat dazed appearance. I've been in the hills of Nelson County celebrating my grandfather's 90th birthday and doing a lot of line dancing, eating a lot of pulled pork, and drinking quite a few IPAs, so it's been a very nice celebration. So I'll start off my comments with a bit of my story. I'm a native of Lynchburg. I grew up here. My mother was one who raised me in this fine town. I eventually left Lynchburg when I joined the United States Army, and I had the great pleasure to be posted in Vicenza, Italy, which is what took me to Europe. That was back in 2002, and I've been there ever since. Since then, I've been lucky, very fortunate to have joined NATO as a staff position with NATO, the North Atlantic Treaty Organization. And part of that is that job has taken me in various places throughout Europe and then further afield. One of my trips was to Morocco back in 2015. And preparing for that trip, my intention was to see the city of Tanger, which Rives Childs was served as the chargé d'affaires at the American legation. So in preparation for that trip, I was looking through the guidebook and I saw that there was this museum for the American legation. I said, well, what is an American legation? It turns out it's an old US embassy. Now, a bit of history here. Morocco was one of the first countries to recognize our nation's independence. And as a result of that, one of the first US embassies abroad was in Tanger. So I went there, I visited the museum, and got to struck a conversation with the director of the museum, who turns out that he was also a chargé d'affaires in Luxembourg at the embassy, at the US embassy, which was just right around the corner from where I was living at that time. So we struck up a conversation, we stayed in touch, and it turns out he wrote a blog. And every once in a while I'd check out his blog, see what he had posted online. And it turns out he had posted a personal reflection and a bit of a biography of Rives Childs. And that sort of piqued a bit of interest. Well, who is this guy? He saved 1,200 Hungarian Jews from extermination, as was commented before. He was a code breaker during World War I. The guy had traveled far and wide across the world at the time when travel was rather arduous and not easy like it is today. So a very interesting individual. And then there was a little thing at the bottom of the biography that he was born in Lynchburg, Virginia. Well, my mind was just blown at that point. So I'm from Lynchburg. And to a degree, I felt a sort of identification. I don't put myself in the same league as Rives Childs, but a sense of wanting to see other places, wanting to travel, wanting to meet other people, try to speak other languages, not very effectively sometimes. So I dug a bit further into his life. Over the years, I would just sort of type in James Rives Childs online and see what popped up. And there was rather scant information available until a certain individual decided to resurrect him and to put a marker on Rivermont Avenue. So I randomly, one day, a few months ago, as I mentioned, typed in his name, saw that a historical marker would be unveiled in Lynchburg, and it was Mrs. Jane White who was behind that. So I wrote to the News in Advance, the newspaper that published the article, and said, could you please put me in touch with this Jane White? Well, the individual was rather late coming back to me, so I dug, and I finally found her personal email address. And I wrote to you, and I said, hey, by the way, I know about this guy in a rather loose sense. I visited the embassy where he used to work. I'm somewhat familiar with his life. I would love to meet with you when I come to my grandfather's 90th birthday in June. So she very graciously replied to me, well, who are you? Are you related to this DeMarco or this DeMarco? I said, oh, no, I'm not, but I'm related to the Dedens family. And they've been here for quite some time. So we struck up a very nice exchange of emails over a period of time. And some of your reflections of digging up the facts about his life and the efforts I know that you went through for us to be here at this event today is very much appreciated. I think it's a very important piece of history. As we all know, Lynchburg is inundated with certain bits of history, primarily the Civil War, and that's very, very important. very interesting. But it's also good to see other more unusual pieces of history that emerge from this very, very fantastic town. So I commend you for your efforts in raising our attention to Rives Child. So my personal reflections of Rives Child is not that I knew the individual personally. He didn't help me through customs. I was just a young boy at the time, probably that he passed away. But I think the spirit of him and what he represents, as was mentioned before by the councilman-elect, is very important, that the city raises people who hopefully take forward a very nice aspect of Southern charm, manners, and dignity throughout the world. So it's very, very much an honor to be here today to share my reflection of Rives Child. And thank you very much, Jane, for everything. Thank you.
Thank you. It is a real pleasure to be here today. And as Jane or Ted noted, I'm not on the program. I wasn't aware of this until very recently, and I saw the announcement and took the initiative to contact Jane to tell her that I knew J. Rives Childs. He was a fraternity brother of mine in college. And just a few weeks after that Hurricane Camille disaster in Nelson County, I went to Randolph-Macon to begin my college education. And the following semester, that would have been the spring of 1970, I pledged and was admitted as a brother in the Virginia Gamma chapter of Phi Delta Theta. Now, if you've been in a sorority or fraternity, you know that one of the things that the brothers teach you are all the great people that have been brothers or sisters, not only nationally, but locally. And of course, I went through that process. And I won't bore you with all the great Phi Delts that there have been in this country, although the first man on the moon was a Phi Delt. But there were 3 living Phi Delt Virginia Gamma brothers, or actually 4, who were in the Richmond area, and we were made certain that we knew who they were. The first was the president of the college, Luther Wesley White III, who is Steve Smallshaw's, was his father-in-law and Mary White's father. So Luther White was somebody we knew and we were impressed by because he was such a distinguished president. The 2 others who were Phi Delta brothers at Virginia Gamma Randolph-Macon chapter were a guy named Chris Chinnery and Alan Chinnery. And I don't know if you know who they are, but they have a sister whose current name is Penny Chinnery Tweedy. And the 3 of them own Meadow Farm and Secretariat, who a few weeks after I graduated won the Triple Crown. So we had, some recognition of them. But the 3rd was James Rives Childs. And we knew about him because there was this collection of rare books in our library about Casanova. And often we would want to go see those books, but you had to be an English major in order to have access to the rare books. So I never saw the Casanova books, but they were there, I'm told. Several years later, my senior year, I was president of the Virginia Gamma chapter of Phi Delta Theta at Randolph-Macon. Every year we have a Founders Day celebration to celebrate the 6 founders of the fraternity. And that year I thought we need to invite all of the alumni in the Richmond area to come share this Founders Day event with us. So of course, J. Rives Childs, who lived in Richmond, was sent an invitation. I never in my life thought that he would accept it. But a few weeks later, several weeks before the Founders Day event, I got a phone call at the fraternity house. It was James Rives Childs. And he introduced himself and he said he was going to be there. He was 80 years old at that time. He said he moved a little slowly, and I wondered if I could arrange for a parking space so it would be easy for him to enter the house. And I said, certainly, sir, we will. Well, he showed up, and as Annie Bennett has described, if you just looked at him, close up or at a distance, what you've said with regard to elegant, poised, regal, those things captured the essence of who he was as a figure. He was not tall in stature, but everything about his movements was so graceful, elegant, and dignified. And then when you spoke to him, his voice was calming confident and very assuring. Well, he came into the house. He was so pleased to be there. I introduced myself, and he made an effort to meet and talk with every brother in the house. And the first thing he would do after he got your name was ask, where are you from? And son, what do you plan to do? So it was a long conversation through the afternoon. The recollections, the three things I remember about him was his description, as Ani has described him, dignified, genteel. I could see him standing in the courts of Ethiopia or Saudi Arabia, just the way he handled himself. He wore a three-piece suit with a gold watch and chain hanging from the vest pocket. When he and I talked a little more about it, he asked where I was from. And I said, well, I am from Lynchburg, Virginia. And he just beamed. Oh, Mr. Nelson, I am a native Lynchburger also. And so we talked some more about where he lived, and he described where he lived. And at that time, I wasn't aware it was that house, but I said, I know your neighborhood, and so forth. The second thing, of course, he was very, very proud of Randolph-Macon College, and he was very proud to be in the fraternity that I was in, and he was proud to be a native Lynchburger. Well, some weeks went by, and I received a telephone call at the fraternity house, and it was Ambassador Childs. And he told me, he said, I want to come see you again. And I said, I'd be pleased to have you come back to our fraternity house. What is it about? And he said, well, I'll tell you when I get there. So he drove up, he had an attendant with him, and he came in, and we had a very brief conversation, but he presented me with a picture, and it was that picture in black and white. And he asked me if I would have it framed and mounted in the fraternity house. And I told him certainly I would. I would be leaving, graduating in a few weeks, but I would see that it was put there. I didn't really know why until later. And I talked to Jane and I read some excerpts about the Rives family. And I understood that he had an older brother, John Wesley Childs, who he adored. And John Wesley died in 1917. He was also a Phi Delta Theta brother at Randolph-Macon. And the family thought so much of the fraternity and the college and mourned the loss of John Childs. They had a donation put together in order to build a new fraternity house. And that fraternity house stood from the mid-1920s until the year before I enrolled in Randolph-Macon. The house that I was in was a brand new colonial revival brick building. He saw the new building and he wanted to have some remembrance of him in that building because he cared so much for the fraternity, the college, and those of us who were his brothers. So I didn't realize the significance of that snapshot in history, but I'm pleased that I can share that with you. In every respect, he was a wonderful representative, not just of this country, but of this city, and he loved Lynchburg so much from everything that he exuded in our conversations. Thank you.
Okay, we're going to close our program
No,
today.
I want to say something.
Oh, all right. Well, please come stand up. Flo Treywick,
I know I'm not on the program.
please stand up. Come on over here.
Thank you. Well, I think this is so exciting to see all of this about James Rives Childs because I was born and raised on Belmont, which is the street that runs in back of Mr. Childs' house. And it was a delightful neighborhood. We had some interesting people there. As a child, I was most interested in Mr. Phillips, who was a Civil War veteran. And so I used to go sit on his porch and have him tell me about the Civil War. But of course, our neighborhood was very cognizant of Rives Childs and his wonderful career in the diplomatic. We had a little personal thing in that my sister was married to a career naval officer. And when his squadron put in whatever the port is, it's Saudi Arabia, one of his staff came to him and said, Captain Luby, the ambassador wants to see you. Well, he said, what in the world does he want to see me for? He couldn't think of a reason. Nonetheless, he put on his best uniform and went to the office. And the ambassador greeted him and said, "Captain Libby, I understand your wife is from Lynchburg." That was the whole mission. Anyway, I want to add my compliments to Jane White, because I had never been associated with one of these dedications or these markers, and I can now appreciate her depth of knowledge of what it takes to get marker approved and established and dedicated. So I know everybody's very familiar with how wonderfully Jane works, but I just wanted to add my personal impression to her abilities. And thank you.
Okay, we're going to close our program today with a very special toast to Ambassador Childs from Bob Garby. Bob, come on up. And we're going to circulate the beverages. Okay. Beverages are coming, so bear with us.
That our family had innumerable connections with Rives Childs, so many that I'm not going to list them all. My grandmother Garby and Rives Childs' mother, Lucy B. Childs, were friends. And our family loves to tell stories, and one that's frequently repeated is about an amusing incident that happened to Lucy B. Childs at one of my grandmother Garby's garden parties. And then, come right on through, get some more, get some more. And then my father-in-law, Judge Barksdale, and Rives Childs were good friends. And there's an often repeated family story about an incredible response Judge Barksdale made in France when Rives Childs introduced him at a military reception with a large number of people. And then in 1960, when Polly and I spent the summer in France, honeymooning, we visited Rives and Georgina. And we must have been excruciatingly circumspect, because there are no stories about that visit. And when we all have, they're pouring as just as fast as they can. But I do think it's important, as so many have said today, that Rives was so very proud of his Lynchburg birth. And it makes a major impression on me to think that a child of Rivermont Avenue, who accomplished so much that he did in all around the world. And I'm not sure if it's true, Jane, but didn't he do a road trip from Cape Town to Cairo?
Yeah, I don't know about that.
I think that
A lot of things I don't know.
I think there's a manuscript, and I don't know where it is, that he wrote that he and Georgina actually did a road trip from Cape Town to Cairo. Take two.
Take two. Sure.
I'm right behind you. Don't forget me.
That's right.
Okay. We all ready? We all ready? Oh, thank you.
Do we have a napkin?
As Jane has pointed out, in his pride of his birthplace, Rives undoubtedly would very much have appreciated that old quote, "To be a Virginian, either by birth, marriage, adoption, or even on one's mother's side, is an introduction to any state of the Union, a passport to any foreign country, and a benediction from above." Here's to Rives.